Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to Rare Variants. In this series, I like to take a lot of our favorite video game consoles that we knew growing up and talk about the oddball versions of them that have come out in different places for different reasons. Usually it's things like special editions, complete redesigns that exist for some strange purpose, or versions that came out in like one country for some reason. There's tons of them out there. Obviously, I don't have them all, but I do have a good chunk of them, and I like to occasionally just throw them out there and talk about them. I also like to kind of dive into the history of them. Like, why does that version exist? What is its story other than it's a console but it's a different color? Or, you know, like, let's talk about it, right? So before we get into all the details of all that with today's story, I just want to say if you guys could please like, comment, and subscribe on this video. I appreciate it. If you're not a subscriber, please join the party. If you can go in the description and follow me on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, all that sort of stuff is always appreciated. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into it. So today we're going to be talking about this. It looks like a Saturn, right? It's not that special. I'm gonna leave the video. I'm not going to subscribe to you. Well, you should, because this is not a Sega Saturn. At least not technically. This is a Samsung Saturn. Yes, you heard that right. Samsung. The Korean company that makes technology made this. Now you a little interested? So this is a very rare, very elusive, very odd, almost mythical version of the Sega Saturn. So in order to really understand the history of this and, you know, everything that makes it special and unique, you really have to dive back into history like a lot. Like, why did this thing come out? What is the circumstances of it? Its history is actually rooted in, like, what I would say real history. Post-World War II, yes, we're going there, two countries that did not really get along after the war was Japan and South Korea. Now, we're not going to go into any of that, but that tension remained and still is there, sadly, to this day. However, it has gotten a lot better in recent years. But basically, in the 80s and the 90s, when video games were surging all over the world and the Japanese were taking everybody by storm with, you know, Nintendo and Sega and everybody else, not surprisingly, people in South Korea were like, sup, I want that. But in South Korea, there were actually laws preventing Japanese companies from doing business there. So things like the Sega Saturn couldn't be released there. Things like the NES could not be released there. So there was a workaround, and a lot of companies took advantage of it. As a result, South Korean video game collecting is a very strange thing because there's just consoles you know that have totally different corporate names on them, and usually complete redesigns by totally different companies, but they're the same console. For example, the 3DO was released there by LG. Like, you know, LG, they make TVs and stuff now. They made a version of the 3DO there that looks surprisingly like a PS1, like the PSONE. The NES/Famicom was released there by a company called Hyundai, you know, the car company. They made a version of the Famicom over there. Now, when it came to Sega, they didn't make a whole lot of attempts to get into South Korea, but this is probably their best known one. They took the Sega Saturn and decided to release it there via Samsung. So for that to work, for that to be satisfied, certain amounts of changes had to be made. Now, you have to remember that while this very much looks like the American Model 1 Sega Saturn, it was meant to just look different from the Japanese Model 1 Sega Saturn, which the two, compared to each other, look very different, at least cosmetically. But yeah, compared to the American Model 1, it's very similar minus a couple of small quirks. So yeah, just keep that in mind. But anyway, so they made those cosmetic changes, which is the most obvious thing when you look at it. It doesn't say Sega anywhere on it. It's replaced entirely with Samsung and Samsung Saturn. It's got some Korean text indicating, you know, power eject and the access light. And of course, things on the back, there's all sorts of stickers saying Samsung. Like I said, it just doesn't say Sega anywhere on it. The controller, too, also says Samsung on it. The only part that actually indicates that it's a Sega console is on the controller itself. Right at the, you know, the plastic piece that goes into the console says Sega on it. And I don't know if that was an oversight in the molding or just nobody cared. I don't know, but that's really the only place it says it, at least on the surface. So when they released this, which they did in late 1995, there were certain things that happened with it. One, they released it for a retail price of about $460 in 1995, adjusted for modern the modern inflation. That's about $850. That's a lot for a Sega Saturn. Now, if you look into it, you'll see that technically there are 4 different versions of this console, but that's not actually true. The console is always consistently the same. There's actually some stickers that will sometimes indicate which version you have, but really they're exactly the same machine. The sticker, what it actually means is, the difference between the 4 versions is the first one was just the console, like a standard released in a box, hey, we sold you a console over the store shelves, that's it. The second version of it was the repackage, which came bundled with 1 game, which was Virtua Fighter Remix, which I believe is the version that this one is. There was a third iteration that came, instead of coming with Virtua Fighter Remix, it came with a boot cartridge, kind of like an Action Replay, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And then the 4th and final version of it came with both the Action Replay boot cartridge, I'm not saying it was actually Action Replay, just something like that, as well as another game, although I couldn't find a record of what that game actually was. But yeah, it released, and it came, there was only like 4 games that came out at launch, and by the end of its run, I think it was only like 8 to 10 games actually officially came out, which is very strange. So what's really unique about it, other than that whole element of it and being very expensive, is that they supposedly only made like 3,000 of these things, which is kind of insane. That's not a high number, and needless to say, it didn't exactly sell very well. In doing some research into this, I found that the most common tactic amongst people in Korea that actually wanted the Saturn was they looked at the Korean one and they're like, I ain't paying that. The Japanese version's like half that. People would just import it anyway. So it really made no difference. The other thing that I think was really the Achilles heel to this whole thing is that they decided to give it its own unique region coding. Now, I have personally made the mistake in the past of assuming it was Japanese region coding because it does read some Japanese discs. Actually, if you look into it, that's a common mistake when people look at it. They think the console might be region-free. Because it's got this weird region coding that can't read all of every region's games, it can read all of its own region, which only has a pitiful amount, but then it can read like some of other regions. And the way that works is if you ever take a bunch of Sega Saturn games, you rip them to a PC, and you can actually load them up with a program called like Saturn Region Coder or whatever. You'll notice every once in a while, there'll be a game that's like got 2 boot sequences or 2 boot options. When it has that version is usually what will run on this. It's to win a strange, useless lottery is to find one of those. But basically what I'm saying is this is debatably one of the most useless versions of the Saturn because of how few games it can actually run. But underneath the hood, in addition to making that change, one of the most bizarre things about it, although not even a bad bizarre, just kind of unique bizarre, is the power supply is pretty much different than any other version of the power supply ever released. At the time in the 90s when South Korea this was going to be released there, they were changing their power grid, I think, from 110 volt to 220 volt standard. And in doing so, they basically created a rule where like everything coming out around that had to function on both systems because they didn't want like stuff, shorting out and all that. So uniquely, the power supply in this console is almost region free. It pretty much will work anywhere, which is kind of neat. So you can plug it in here, or theoretically you can plug it into Europe and it should be fine. I'm not 100% on that. That's what I read. I'm not going to try it. I know it works here, and that's good enough for me. But yeah, so very, very bizarre little entity. But other than that, they really didn't do anything else under there. It's just the strange BIOS, unique power supply, and then again, compared to Japan, it's got a completely different color scheme. But let's go ahead and take a quick look at it, shall we? So what we're going to do here is, this is an American game. This is a copy of Sega Rally Championship. Now, you know what? There's another thing I should point out. As soon as it boots up, you'll see it. You would expect some sort of custom BIOS. You don't get one. It's actually, and you'll notice that it's not in Korean. We'll get back to that. It's in English. So we go ahead and boot that up. It still thinks it's 1994, as always. But you'll see, this is just the North American BIOS, pretty much, and it says Sega Saturn in the BIOS. And it will actually not be able to read this game, right? Okay, despite having an American BIOS, it's not actually American, so it can't read an American disc, and that's all it's really complaining about right now. Not a problem, that's to be expected. So the funny thing is that BIOS is unique to this version of the Saturn, and not really in a good way. Basically, all they did was take the American BIOS and they removed any sort of Japanese region language. So the Japanese language never appears. That's actually what the part about that's unique. But they honestly never thought that it made any sense to put the Korean language in there, which, I mean, if you were trying to get into that market, like, what are you doing? It's on the console. It's uniquely coming out in South Korea, but they didn't bother to put the Korean language in. Anyway, right now we're going to run is Nights into Dreams. This is also the American version. Now, why am I bothering with that? Shouldn't it just spin out? Yeah, this is one of those dual boot games. So you just so you're clear on what you just saw, American game here doesn't work. American game here totally works. Why? Dual boot. It's just strange. Like I said, it's got this unique region coding that is not standard. But yeah, you get it. This disc works. So when we move on to the next one, the next game I have up here that we're going to point out for a very specific reason, this is Virtua Fighter Remix. Now this is a Japanese disc. Now again, remember the console is not Japanese, so this disc shouldn't actually work. We'll skip past all that. Again, American BIOS, Japanese game, Korean console, not supposed to function. And yet it does. Because Virtua Fighter Remix is also one of these strange dual boot games. So this is an unmodified console that can sort of play both American and Japanese games. Now do you see why this thing's kind of weird? But yeah, all right, you get the idea. But, you know, maybe you're saying, like, I've heard before that it actually plays Japanese games. Like, maybe that's just a fluke thing about Night. So, all right, no problem. That's no big deal. We'll turn on another one. This is Rabbit. This is a fighting game that only came out in Japan. It was actually made by EA and was never released here, which is kind of strange for them to make a game for Japan only, but they did. It's actually a pretty decent fighting game, actually. Now, that should work, right? Oh, what do you know? It didn't. Another Japanese game, and it doesn't work. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. It's because it's not really a region-free console. So, what's the deal? What about its own games? No problem. We actually have one. This is a Samsung Saturn version of Virtual-On. Now, this, of course, has its own region coding, as you would expect, and it's got its own artwork that says Samsung Saturn on it and all that sort of stuff. And not surprisingly, yes, of course, this disc is going to function. But yeah, how weird is it? Everything you just saw. Like, I didn't bother testing PAL stuff. I know it's not going to work, and I don't think I have any of the dual boot ones anyway, if there even are any. But same basic idea. Like, it's only going to work if you could get past the region coding. Which, interestingly, maybe we can. This is a device called the Pseudo Saturn. I did an entire video on this. Now, this is actually why it was bundled with an Action Replay at one point. They knew they messed up. They knew they messed up when they made the thing not region-free, because people were like, there's no games to buy, because you only released like 8. Why would I bother buying this? That was a last-minute ditch attempt. Like, oh, give them a cartridge, and then they can import all the Japanese and American and European games they want. I would imagine more so the American. This is a hacked version of the same idea, and this one will just automatically run. I put Rabbit back in there, which you guys saw fail, and now it totally works. Which the point of the video isn't about Pseudo Saturn and getting past security and all that, but just to make the point that it does work. And actually, this cartridge would allow the console to now play burn discs if I really wanted it to. But you're getting it now. It's a very strange version of the Sega Saturn, but it oddly, well, Samsung Saturn, is really just, I'm not going to say it's Samsung's first attempt at a home console, but it is certainly one of the most unique. If you end up looking for one of these now, good luck with that. I have a friend who I would consider, and I think he would probably consider himself this too, a professional video game hunter. He lives in South Korea. He goes to Japan all the time and he finds great stuff. His name is Fox. He's a buddy of mine. He's found unbelievable things over there that you would never normally find. Lives in South Korea. I gave him the task years ago. In like 2017, I was like, dude, find me one of these. And he's like, I'm on it. Never found one. Ever. Except for one that he found that wasn't for sale. It was in private collectors' hands. He said that you just can't find them. They just don't exist anymore. So the big issue was only about 3,000 of these were ever made. And it's sold poorly, so that doesn't actually mean 3,000 were sold. And the other big difference is Korean culture versus Japanese culture. And I don't mean the issues between the two cultures. I just mean the fundamental difference in like what you do with things. The Japanese are very preservationist. They like to take care of stuff because it has some sort of value down the road, theoretically. So that means whether or not you recycle it, you donate it, you sell it, whatever you do with it, hold on to it because it has some value. The Korean philosophy is essentially the opposite, which is out with the old, in with the new. Oh, the Samsung Saturn, that's trash now. Get rid of that, get the new thing. So most of them were very likely destroyed over time. In fact, I would argue it's a safe bet that more Samsung Saturns exist in North America, US and Canada combined, than exist in South Korea at this point, which is kind of sad, but wouldn't really surprise me. Because the only people who would care about it really are super collectors like myself. So realistically, if you want this, there's not a very good chance you're ever going to find one. I think at the time I'm making this, there's one on eBay, and they're asking an astronomical amount of money. And again, it's not even a Korean seller. Now, you might be wondering, well, okay, dude, how did you get yours? So the thing is, if you've watched my channel for years, you'll know that I've talked about this console a few times. You know, I've wanted it, but it's such an elusive, hard thing to find. For years, all I had actually was this. There was a guy who had contacted me years ago. His name was Saturn HST. He had actually just sent that to me. He's like, yeah, you know, I can hook you up with this, and you'll feel like you're closer to the console. And I was like, oh, that's neat. So I held on to it. And that, I thought, was going to be as close as I would ever get to it. And then randomly, years later, Saturn HST emails me, and he's just like, hey man, so I have 2 Samsung Saturns, and I'm willing to sell you one. And I was like, what? But then I was like, dude, I appreciate that, but I can't realistically afford whatever it is you're going to want for that thing. And then he cut me an unbelievable deal. It's not important to say, but he sold it way under what he could have, and he shipped it like immediately. It was an unbelievable deal, and it was just really nice of him to do that. And he basically did it so that we could all enjoy it on the channel and, you know, talk about it, and you guys could see it. So I hope everybody will thank Saturn HST for doing that. He took a big hit financially for what he sold this to me for. So thank you to him. But yeah, that's pretty much the story of the Samsung Saturn. It's very, very cool, but ultimately kind of the most pointless version of the Saturn, but very, very neat. So yeah, that'll about do it, I think. If you guys could do me a favor, like, comment, subscribe, go into the description, click on all the social media things, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, etc. Follow me on those things. As always, share the video if you don't mind. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.